Please take your Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians 10. We're going to continue in our study in Corinthians. And chapters 8, 9, and 10. They're all linked together. They all are dealing in some way with meats offered to idols. Now I know sometimes people read a chapter and later they read another chapter and they may fail to see the connection, but I hope that you will see the connection between 8, 9, and 10. Now somebody may go to chapter 8 and they say, I say warning against idolatry, and they start reading and they read about, fathers all under the cloud, passed through the sea, ate the same spiritual food, drank the same spiritual drink, overthrown in the wilderness. Sounds like Old Testament stuff. And then they get on later and they read, idolatry, idol, demons. What I hope we can do in these very few minutes, I don't have just a few minutes. I usually quit about 5:45. I didn't do that. I guess that was a warning. But what I hope we can do is to see this kind of connection with these 3 chapters and kind of fit a little bit of it together. Now, there's 2 things that I want you to be seeing to start with. The first is a brother, even me, even you, can fall. And this is dealt with in all 3 chapters. Look at chapter 8. Chapter 8. Towards the end of the chapter, look at verses 11 through 13. 11 through 13. And so by your knowledge this weak person is destroyed. King James Version says perish. The brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Now, he uses the word stumble here 2 times in verse 13. But if we want to know the serious nature of this stumbling, it's verse 11, with that word destroyed or perish. Now, keep in mind, this word is used of a Christian. And he can get to the state that's described as destroyed or perish. Now look in chapter 9. Chapter 9. Look at verses 26 and 27. Paul says, so I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air. But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. You may have the word castaway. Castaway, disqualified. This is Paul. If Paul could be disqualified or a castaway, it's clear. A person who is a Christian can also get to the state where he's disqualified or a castaway. Now look at chapter 10. Chapter 10. And I hesitate right here because I'm looking at 32 verses in this chapter. And I think about time. And we're trying to tie together 8, 9, and 10. So let's just kind of summarize some things. See, he starts out in chapter 10, verse 1, calling our attention to the Israelites. And he speaks of how that he says, were all under the cloud and passed through the sea, and all were baptized unto Moses. You know, it's almost making, can we put it this way? Making these Old Testament Israelites sound like they become Christians. Are they Christians in the sense of Jesus? Well, no. Children of God, yes. But it would call to mind these readers their Christian life. They were baptized, and now look in verse 2. After the baptism of Moses, says verse 3, all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. And the readers are probably thinking, that's what we do. We have the Lord's Supper, this spiritual food and spiritual drink. It would almost like it'd have to come to their mind. So kind of establishing something here. Here's God's people. Here's the saved folks. But then you get down to verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. You know, once again, talking about the idea of a brother can fall, here we find a nation of people, the majority of whom were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, verse 8, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. So he's kind of saying, take note of this. They fell. And the implication, they're your examples. You can too. So then he warns in verse 7, do not be idolaters. And then in verse 7, kind of end of it, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Exodus 32 verse 6 is where you'd find this. Verse 9, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. You can read about Exodus 32 verses 25 through 29. Verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. Numbers 21 verses 5 and 6. Verse 10, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer, as you'd find in Numbers 14:37. The point of all this, you see verses 1 through 3, 4, it's like these are the good folks. They're God's people. But then they didn't do so good. And they were destroyed because of it. This was verse 5, an example for us. Now verse 11. Now these things happened to them as an example. They are written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So all of this about here were God's people who were destroyed is implying here we can be God's people, yet come to a state where, well, you find it back in chapter 8, where you find the word destroyed or perish. You get to chapter 9, verse 27, and you find the word disqualified. And then here we find multiple examples of those who fell and were destroyed. So this is to be kept in mind. A brother can so fall. Wait, preacher. There are folks who teach once saved, always saved. You can be sure chapters 8, 9, and 10 do not teach once saved, always saved. Rather, they should make us kind of sit up and realize, if Paul says he could be disqualified, I need to pay attention. I need to pay attention. So, one thing that ties these three chapters together is a brother can fall. And that's kind of a bit of the reason for this. As Paul knows, the brother can fall. Don't you dare be the cause of that brother stumbling or falling. Now, sometimes the word offense is used. We use the word offense a little bit different fashion. Made mention of this last week of I don't like that. It offends me. The word offense is used more in the sense here and translated sometimes the idea of stumbling. Stumbling. It's not just that this brother doesn't like what you do, it's what you've done has caused him to stumble. Now I want you to see this in these three verses. Look at chapter 8, verses 9 through 13. Chapter 8, verses 9 through 13. He said, "But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will be not encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols, and so by your knowledge this weak person is destroyed. The brother for whom Christ died, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their consciences, when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." You see, he can stumble. Paul said, we don't want him to stumble. So we're going to avoid what could cause him to stumble. You get to chapter 9. In chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, talked about this last week, is where Paul is basically saying, I've got some rights. I've got the right, and he went at length about the idea of right to accept financial support. And he went in various ways and proved that fact. I've got this right. He even had the right, he said, to have a wife. But he decided, I will forego these rights. And the reason that he would forego these rights, well, chapter 9 and verse 12. If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Now look down at verse 19. Still in chapter 9 verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Somebody might say, well, that's talking about people becoming Christians. With that concern and willing to give up so others would become Christians, you could be sure the point of this is, listen, so absolutely you give up, you do whatever you need so that your brother doesn't stumble, so that your brother stays saved, so that your brother doesn't perish. Then, when we get to chapter 10, I want you to look at several verses here. Chapter 10. Look down at verse 24. Chapter 10, verse 24. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Now back in chapter 9, Paul said, I've got these rights. We as Americans are all about our rights. And most of the time it's kind of this way. I've got my rights, and I'm going to hold on to my rights, and I'm going to use my rights, and I'm going to exercise my rights regardless. Paul's idea, if it's for the good of brother, I'll give up my rights. And not only that, verse 24 that we just read, it's not just all about you seeking your own good, but you seek the good of your neighbor. You want to see that brother saved in the last day. You want to see him have a walk with Christ that's consistent, that's faithful, so that he hears one day, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Now look down at verse 28. Verse 28. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice." Now, he's describing here the situation of verse 27. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, and you are disposed to go, you choose to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions, where did this come from? No, don't raise any questions. But if someone says to you, that's the 28, "This has been offered in sacrifice," the idea of sacrifice to idols. Then he says, "Then do not eat it." Wait. Now back in chapter 8, he says, we've got knowledge. And we know that the idols are nothing. So if the idols are nothing, what's the big deal about eating the meat, that's offered to the idols? Well, we could say, yes, meat is meat is meat. But see what he says here. Do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience. You see, you know enough to know an idol is nothing, and meat is meat is meat, and so it matters not that I eat it. But yet this guy that's sitting with you, I got something really good for you tonight. This is to the God. I was really looking forward to that steak. But if you think that I eating this in some way honors your idol, I can't eat it. And there's this brother who his conscience, well, it's a little different than mine in this regards. Oh, he knows an idol is nothing, but he hasn't quite fully grasped it. And just in case it's going to hurt him, not going to eat. Look at verse 29. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? And then you read the answer to these questions. Verse 31. So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, to all the glory of God. Now get this. Verse 32. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. Verse 33. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. So keep in mind, in all three chapters, you have this idea running through. A brother can be lost. A brother can perish. He can be disqualified. He can be destroyed. We don't want that to happen. And so if there's something that we do that might in some way cause that, we just don't do it. Within this context, it was the meats offered to idols. And so his idea is, even if I've got the right, even if I have the conscience to know that an idol is nothing, even though I understand that meat is meat is meat, if I'm going to give the impression to this idolatrous worship that now I'm participating in this idolatrous worship, If I'm going to, in some way, cause his brother to stumble, or put his foot back in that idolatrous worship, I'll forgo that. You know, one thing that we would have to admit and acknowledge, we see here the importance of our brother and sister in Christ Jesus. So important. And it's important more than my rights. It's important more than my appetites. It's important more than my knowledge. The threat of a brother falling, the threat of you do this for your brother. And then certainly then there's this threat of idolatry. In fact, here within this chapter, after he moves past kind of this Old Testament section, you find in one place in the Old Testament, in verse 6, you find idolaters there. Well, verse 7. Then in verse 14, idolatry. Then verse 19, you find the word idol twice. And so he's wanting and he's pressing the point, stay away from idols. In fact, we even have the phrase, flee from idolatry. Now I know that it's almost like there's a context here that we may say, it's just outside of our... Okay, I get the part that a brother can fall, and I get the part that I don't need to cause him to stumble. I'd better not. But this idolatry part, hey, most of us just don't see an idol on a daily basis. And that's just not a part of our... maybe the idols of the first century, maybe not so much. But you probably grew up like I did, hearing, well, what's an idol? Anything that comes between you and God. How many things have we made idols? How many things have people decided, okay, Sunday's the Lord's Day, Sunday's that day to be in worship, but it's almost like they got a list of things that they will do in place of being in worship. In their mind, mentally, they do. Maybe it's a family reunion. Maybe it's, I'm on vacation. Maybe it's, I'm traveling, so I don't have to worship today. And maybe they've not written it down, but mentally they have in mind some things that literally come between them and God. Yes, idolatry is still practiced today, and too often idolatry is within the hearts of men, and too often it's within the hearts of individuals who are Christians. Okay, I'm not going to go until 5:45. But I want to close by going back up to verse 12. Chapter 10, verse 12. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. In chapters 8 through 10, he's acknowledged people who have, he has taken notice of people who have knowledge, have a stronger conscience possibly, and some who are having a weaker conscience maybe don't have as strong a knowledge. Verse 12 is all encompassing. How many years have you been a Christian? Could you even begin to count the number of assemblies that you have been in? Are there many songs that are sung, but what you haven't sung them before? And oftentimes you could go to services and, in fact, not use PowerPoint or a songbook because you knew the songs. And maybe good old brother so-and-so, you could almost pray his prayer. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Wait, preacher. I are one. I'm a preacher, or I'm an elder, or I'm a deacon, or I'm a Bible class teacher, or, I'm grandma, and I've taught the little children. I don't teach them now, but I've taught my grandchildren. I'm teaching now my great-grandchildren. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. Now look at verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. That takes away all our excuses, doesn't it? You don't know how strong this temptation was. No temptation is overtaking you, but such as is common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, He will also provide a way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Takes away all excuses, doesn't it? And so Paul, how should we be? Chapter 11, verse 1, summarizes and ends this entire section. Paul says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. All that he said in chapter 9 about himself, giving up rights, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. He says, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that they may be saved, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So when you think of these three chapters, you recall there's the idea of this brother falling. And there is certainly this idea of don't you dare be the cause of that brother falling. And in the specific context of meat offered to idols, give up your rights if need be. Make the application where it may be in other areas. Be sure to realize my brother is important. If we could assist you in your obedience, the need for baptism, if we could pray for you, if you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.